They say greed makes men blind, but I never thought I'd watch it play out so close. After months of sleepless nights, after missing birthdays and dinners, I finally held 2 Super Bowl tickets in my hands. My reward, my chance to make it up to my son. But before I could even tell him, my boss snatched them away. He smirked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You should be grateful you still have a job." I bit my tongue, forced a smile, and whispered the words that sealed his fate. "Enjoy the game." He had no idea what was coming. I used to believe hard work would shield me, that every late night at the office and every sacrifice at home would eventually be worth it. For years, I poured myself into this company, shaping projects from the ground up, holding everything together while others clocked out and went home to their families. My own family only saw me in passing. My wife grew tired of cold dinners left on the table. My son stopped waiting up for me, too young to understand why his father's chair sat empty at the kitchen table. That winter, we were in the final stretch of a massive project. I worked until my eyes burned, the glow of spreadsheets and code bleeding into the early hours. Every missed basketball game, every forgotten bedtime story, every argument with my wife, they all stacked up inside me. But I kept telling myself, this will pay off. It has to. When the client handed me 2 tickets to the Super Bowl, my chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in years: validation. It wasn't just paper, it was a promise. I imagined leaning over to my son in the stadium, both of us screaming as our team charged the field, the roar of the crowd drowning out years of disappointment. That night, for the first time in a long time, I let myself smile. But dreams have a way of drawing predators. Richard Cole, my boss, spotted the envelope before I had even tucked it away. His eyes flickered like a man who'd seen a pile of gold on the ground. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared, and in that silence, I saw something dangerous: envy, entitlement, the kind of hunger that turns men cruel. Then he smirked, that familiar smug expression he wore whenever he reminded us that he was the gatekeeper of our futures. I told myself I was imagining it, that no one could be so brazen as to steal what didn't belong to them. But the unease gnawed at me. That night, when I crept through the door, my wife was waiting. "You promised you'd be home for dinner," she snapped, arms crossed, eyes tired. Behind her, the kitchen table was cleared, except for a plate wrapped in foil. My son was already asleep upstairs. I didn't tell her about the tickets. I wanted it to be a surprise, a way to redeem myself. Instead, I muttered an apology and trudged into the quiet of our home, guilt pressing down heavier than the briefcase in my hand. The next morning, the inevitable happened. Richard cornered me in his office. He held the tickets between his fingers, fanning them like a deck of cards. "These," he said casually, "were given to the company. It's only right management handles them." His tone wasn't up for debate. My mouth went dry. For a moment, I thought about fighting back, telling him the client gave them to me, that they had my name written on the envelope. But then he leaned forward, lowering his voice until it felt like a blade against my throat. "Be smart, Michael. You want to keep your job, don't you?" I forced a laugh, though it came out cracked. "Of course, if that's what you think is best." My lips curled upward, but my eyes betrayed me, stinging hot as I fought not to break. He pocketed the tickets with a satisfied grin, patting my shoulder like he'd just done me a favor. When I walked out, one of my closest colleagues brushed past and whispered, He's done worse. Don't think you're the first." The words rattled inside me. Richard had stolen from others, used his power like a crowbar to pry open whatever he wanted, and no one ever stopped him. That evening, I sat at the edge of my son's bed as he held up a crumpled flyer of his favorite quarterback. His eyes glowed with hope. "Dad, are we going to the Super Bowl?" The question gutted me. My throat locked, my hands trembling against the blanket. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I managed a weak smile, kissed his forehead, and said, "We'll see." In the dark, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the hallway, drowning in shame. To him, I was supposed to be a hero. Instead, I felt like a coward, letting another man rob me of more than just tickets, of my dignity, of my promise to my own child. But while Richard thought he had won, he didn't see me slip my phone into my pocket during that conversation. He didn't hear the faint click as the recording app captured every arrogant word he spoke. He believed my silence meant defeat. He believed I was weak. And maybe that was the best mistake he could ever make. The Monday after Richard pocketed the tickets, I forced myself back into routine. On the surface, nothing had changed. Coffee in hand, a tired smile for colleagues, a quick shuffle to my desk. Inside, though, everything was different. I was no longer just an overworked employee. I was a man who had been robbed in plain sight. I began to notice things I had ignored before. Small packages arriving at Richard's office with no record in the system. Expensive bottles of whiskey tucked discreetly into his cabinet. Client lunches billed to the company, but attended by no one but him. One afternoon, during a team presentation, he connected his laptop to the projector. For a split second, before the slide deck opened, his inbox flashed onto the screen. The subject line of the top email burned into my mind. "Appreciate the gift. Expecting more next quarter." He scrambled to close it, pretending nothing had happened. Most people in the room looked away. I didn't. That half second confirmed everything I suspected. The deeper I watched, the clearer the pattern became. Richard didn't just steal from me. He fed off the company like a parasite, trading integrity for perks, betraying those who trusted him. I spoke quietly to an older coworker who had been around long before me. He sighed, eyes heavy. "You're not the first. A guy named Harris, brilliant, loyal. Richard set him up, made him the scapegoat for a project failure, forced him out. That's his game." The revelation twisted my stomach. This wasn't about tickets anymore. Richard was a predator, and we were his herd. That night, I slumped onto the couch beside my son. The Super Bowl commercials flashed across the TV, bright and booming. His eyes lit up as he leaned forward, excitement spilling from him. "Dad, imagine if we were there." I nodded weakly, the ache in my chest almost unbearable. To him, it was still a dream. To me, it was a wound that deepened every time I saw his smile. I realized then that Richard thought he had silenced me with intimidation, but all he had done was wake something in me. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to confront him outright. My silence would be my mask, my compliance a cover. If he believed I was a fool, then I would let him. And while he basked in the glow of stolen glory at the Super Bowl, I would prepare my own play for Monday. I started small, keeping up the act. I laughed at his jokes, nodded during meetings, carried out tasks without complaint. To him, I was harmless, a loyal subordinate who knew his place. But beneath that mask, I began to gather pieces. While reviewing files for an upcoming contract, I stumbled across the original agreement from the client, the very one that accompanied the tickets. My name was printed clearly in bold, complimentary VIP tickets awarded to Michael Turner for project leadership. My pulse hammered. Proof. Undeniable black and white proof. I scanned it, saved it under a benign file name, and tucked the original into a folder at home. But paranoia gnawed at me. What if my computer was checked? What if Richard had allies watching? That night, after everyone was asleep, I uploaded the document to a secure cloud drive under a false account. As the progress bar reached 100%, a calm settled over me. Whatever happened, the truth now lived in more than one place. The act of safeguarding it gave me a strange sense of power. I began to imagine Richard's smirk faltering, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his own lies. The thought alone was enough to steady me. One evening, while tucking my son into bed, I sat down beside him. He was drawing superheroes, sketching capes and masks with crayons. "Dad," he asked suddenly, "what do heroes do when people are unfair to them?" I paused, his innocent question cutting straight through me. I ruffled his hair and said softly, "Heroes keep proof. They don't always fight loud, but they make sure the truth comes out." His small nod, his trust in me, strengthened my resolve. With each passing day, Richard grew bolder, talking about his weekend plans in front of the team, boasting about exclusive seats. He had no idea that every arrogant word, every careless slip, was being filed away against him. On the Friday before the Super Bowl, while the office buzzed with chatter about the big game, I stayed late at my desk. The building was quiet, the air heavy. My finger hovered over the send button of a carefully crafted email. Attached were scans, screenshots, and a recording, evidence that pointed directly to Richard. But I wasn't ready to send it yet, not openly. That would be too obvious. Instead, I scheduled it. Sunday night, while Richard cheered in the stadium, that email would silently deliver itself to the executive board. By the time he walked into the office Monday morning, believing he had gotten away with everything, the ground beneath him would already be crumbling. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor painting my face. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel control return. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about balance, about showing my son that silence didn't mean surrender. Richard thought Sunday night would be his victory. He didn't realize that for me, Monday morning would be the real game. Monday arrived heavy with anticipation. I woke before dawn, not because I had to, but because sleep was impossible. Downstairs, the house was still and silent. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared at the clock. The email I had scheduled was already in the inboxes of the executive board. Richard was still sleeping off his weekend of luxury, probably dreaming of the stadium roar. He had no idea his empire of lies had already begun to collapse. When I walked into the office, he was waiting in the lobby, radiant in a new suit. A smug grin plastered across his face. He clapped me on the back as though we were old friends. "Hell of a weekend," he bragged, his voice carrying across the floor. "Best seats in the house, private box, champagne flowing all night. You should have seen the look on Brady's face when, oh, that's right, you couldn't." The laughter that followed wasn't shared. Some of my coworkers forced smiles, but most avoided eye contact. I kept my expression calm, nodding once, letting him think his words cut deeper than they did. We filed into the morning meeting. The usual routine of quarterly updates and performance charts. Richard leaned back in his chair, basking in the spotlight, as though the weekend victory belonged to him alone. Then, without warning, the room shifted. The executives' faces tightened, their tablets lit up, their eyes narrowing as they scrolled. One of them glanced sharply at Richard, then at me, then back to the glowing screen. The micro cliffhanger hung in the air like static before a storm. My pulse quickened, but I stayed perfectly still. Only I knew what they were reading. Not just the story of 2 stolen tickets, but a careful trail of receipts, emails, and recordings that painted a far darker picture. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, unauthorized expense accounts, lavish gifts from clients, a history of manipulation and theft stretching back years. Richard, oblivious, kept talking, filling the silence with stories of luxury boxes and celebrity encounters. His voice faltered only when the division head cleared his throat and said, "Richard, we need to speak with you privately, now." The color drained from his face, his grin cracking into confusion. "What? In the middle of the meeting?" "Now," the man repeated, rising from his chair. For a fleeting second, Richard's eyes flicked toward me. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Suspicion. His jaw tightened. My stomach clenched, but I lifted my coffee to my lips and took a slow sip. Calm, detached, as if nothing in the world could rattle me. He stood, straightened his jacket, and followed them out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room buzzing with unspoken questions. Nobody dared voice them, but everyone felt the shift. Richard's invincibility had cracked. Hours later, he returned, pale and shaken. His swagger had evaporated, replaced by a cold fury simmering just beneath the surface. He stalked toward me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You think this will touch me? You don't know who you're dealing with. I'll drag you down with me before I fall." His hand trembled as he adjusted his tie, but his eyes burned with venom. That was the micro cliffhanger I needed. His threat was a confession in itself, one I silently recorded on my phone tucked in my pocket. By the end of the day, rumors spread like wildfire. Executives had met behind closed doors for hours, emerging grim-faced. Richard's name circulated in hushed voices, the words audit and investigation peppered in between. My colleagues avoided me, not out of mistrust, but because they feared proximity to the storm. When I left the office that evening, I walked into the warm glow of my home. My wife had set the table, my son waiting with his homework spread out. For the first time in months, I sat down without rushing, without my mind elsewhere. The weight that had crushed me began to lift. My son looked up and grinned. "You're home, Dad." Just 2 words, but they filled a void no stadium could ever match. Later, while I washed the dishes, my phone buzzed. An internal memo. Richard Cole had been suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. My breath caught. It was happening faster than I'd imagined. But victory never comes without shadows. The next morning, Richard stormed past my desk, his belongings shoved into a box. He paused, leaning close enough that I could feel his breath. "This isn't over," he hissed, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then he walked away, flanked by security, his smirk lingering like a poison. I sat still, heart steady, the sound of his footsteps fading into silence. For the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't afraid. The fallout began almost immediately. By midweek, headlines splashed across every major business outlet. Executives suspended amid corruption allegations. The company's logo was plastered on television screens, not for innovation or success, but scandal. Shareholders panicked. Stock prices dipped like a stone tossed into a pond. What had once seemed like an isolated theft now revealed itself as something larger, uglier. At first, I thought it would blow over, that Richard would be quietly removed and the machine would keep turning. But the machine was already breaking down. The first mini-twist came when an investigative journalist unearthed patterns of bribes linked to multiple contracts. It wasn't just Richard pocketing perks. It was an entire network of backdoor deals and payoffs. The story snowballed, dragging more names into the light. I tried to keep my life normal, to shield my family from the chaos. One evening, I came home weary from another tense day at work. My son ran up to me, clutching a football in his small hands. "Dad," he said proudly, "you're braver than any quarterback." I knelt down, speechless. He didn't understand the complexity of corruption or the risk I'd taken, but he saw me as someone who had stood up when it mattered. That simple faith pierced deeper than any applause ever could. Still, shadows followed me. One night, as I locked up the office, I felt eyes on me. A black sedan idled across the street, headlights off, its engine humming low. As I stepped into the parking lot, the driver flicked a lighter, a brief flash illuminating a face I didn't recognize. When I turned my head, the car rolled away, leaving only the echo of tires against pavement. My chest tightened. This was bigger than Richard. It was spreading into places I hadn't yet seen. The micro cliffhanger of being watched gnawed at me, even as I tried to appear unfazed. The next morning, the inevitable struck. Federal agents marched through the glass doors, their badges gleaming under the lobby lights. Murmurs rippled across the office as men in suits disappeared into conference rooms. An official statement declared the opening of a full-scale investigation by economic crime units. Employees whispered in corners, too afraid to speak aloud. I sipped my coffee, steady on the outside, but inside a storm brewed. The game I had started was no longer mine to control. Days blurred into weeks. The domino effect rippled outward with ruthless precision. Senior managers were summoned for questioning, and one by one, familiar faces vanished. Desks were emptied overnight. The parking lot, once full, now had gaps like missing teeth. The next mini-twist came during an internal leak. Richard wasn't alone. He had powerful allies, the kind of friends who didn't sit in cubicles, but in boardrooms and country clubs. The scandal reached higher than anyone imagined, beyond my division, beyond the company. For a moment, I wondered if I had kicked a door I wasn't meant to open. At the grocery store one Saturday, I spotted an old colleague by the frozen aisle. He froze mid-step, eyes wide, then quickly turned his cart down another lane. He didn't want to be seen with me. My role in all this, whether as whistleblower or pawn, had branded me radioactive. I stood there staring at melting ice cream in my cart, realizing how isolating the fight for truth could be. That night, while sorting through bills at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You don't know who you're fighting." My fingers went cold, the letters burning into my retinas. My wife noticed the look on my face, but I slipped the phone away, forcing a smile. I didn't want fear to spread to her too, but the words looped in my head long after the lights went out. The true cliffhanger came days later. As dusk fell, I pulled into my driveway. The porch light glowed, but the street was unusually quiet. I stepped out, briefcase in hand, and froze. A familiar figure leaned against the railing, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. Richard. No longer in tailored suits, he looked worn, disheveled, but his smirk was intact, sharper than ever. "You and I," he said, exhaling smoke into the cool night air. "We're not finished." My throat tightened. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not at my house, not in front of my family. And for the first time since this began, I felt the true weight of the war I had walked into. Richard didn't storm into my home the way I expected. He stepped inside quietly, almost deferential, the smoke from his half-finished cigarette trailing behind him like a shadow. My wife froze in the doorway, eyes wide with fear, while my son clutched her side, his small frame trembling. I gestured for them to go upstairs. "It's okay," I lied, though my own chest felt like it might crack open. They hesitated, then disappeared up the stairs, leaving me alone with the man who had stolen so much. Richard sat at the dining table, uninvited, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw tight. The arrogance I'd always known had drained from his face, replaced by desperation. "Michael," he started, voice hoarse, "you need to retract your statement. Take it back. Tell them you made a mistake." I didn't answer. I stood across from him, arms folded, waiting. He mistook my silence for resistance that could be broken with persuasion. "You think you've won, but you don't understand the people you've provoked. This isn't just about me. There's a system behind all of this. Bigger men than me. Men who control entire industries." His eyes darted toward the window, as if those men might be watching him even here. The mini twist sliced through me. For the first time, I saw Richard not as the predator, but as prey to something larger. Still, sympathy was far from what I felt. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. It landed on the table with a dull thud, heavy enough to speak for itself. "Take this," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "No one has to know. You can walk away clean, forget the tickets, forget the investigation, just let this go." The micro cliffhanger held me in place. The envelope sat between us like a test, a temptation. I could almost hear it whisper, "Take the money. Buy peace. Buy silence." My son's footsteps creaked faintly on the floor above, reminding me of the reason I couldn't. I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I leaned forward, meeting Richard's frantic gaze with calm resolve. "Get out." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he laughed, a bitter, broken laugh that sounded more like a sob. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You think you're righteous, Michael, but you're standing on quicksand. When you sink, don't expect a hand to pull you up." He left the envelope on the table, his parting gift, or perhaps his final insult, and slammed the door behind him. When I went upstairs, my son clung to my wife, his face buried in her shoulder. "Is he gone?" he whispered. I nodded, pulling him into my arms. His small body shook against mine, and I hated Richard more than ever. Not for the tickets, not even for the corruption, but for planting fear in my child's heart. The next morning, I carried the envelope straight to the local precinct. The officer who received it raised his brows at the stack of bills inside, carefully logging it as evidence. My hands felt lighter when I left the station, as though I'd finally placed a burden down. Days later, the mini twist revealed itself. Buried deep in the countless emails and reports, I stumbled upon a message addressed to me alone. It wasn't from the company. It wasn't from law enforcement. The subject line read, "You're not alone." The sender identified themselves only as the network. They claimed to be a group of employees across industries, quietly gathering evidence against men like Richard, against the system he had whispered about. My first instinct was disbelief, then suspicion. But attached to the email were files, documents from companies I had never worked for, scandals eerily similar to ours, proof that my battle was just one piece of a sprawling war. The micro cliffhanger hit when a second email arrived within minutes, signed again, the network. This time, it wasn't files. It was an invitation. Join us. We've been watching. We need you. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, words she had once spoken after my father passed. "Your father was a good man, Michael, but he never stood up when he should have. Don't make his mistake." And now, years later, she told me again, her hands clasping mine when I visited her that week. "Son, you've done what your father never dared. You've brought light into the dark." Her pride warmed me more than any corporate award ever could. But pride carried weight. The cliffhanger loomed larger than ever as I read the final line of the network's email. This was never about one company. It's about all of them. The question is, will you fight? I closed my laptop slowly, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. The tickets, the humiliation, Richard, they suddenly felt like sparks compared to the wildfire that waited ahead. Leaving the company wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined. No speeches, no grand exits, just a signed resignation letter, a cleared desk, and the quiet sound of my footsteps echoing down the hallway. But as the glass doors closed behind me, I felt something I hadn't in years: freedom. For too long, I had been chained to a place that fed off silence and fear. Now, even though uncertainty stretched ahead, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Within weeks, I joined a new firm. They promised transparency, integrity, values I had nearly forgotten were possible in business. But the real twist came on my first day when I met the leadership team. They weren't strangers. They were people I had seen fall before, casualties of men like Richard. One had been forced out after blowing the whistle on fraud, another sidelined for refusing to play along with corruption. They had built this company not just as a workplace, but as a haven. I realized then that this wasn't just a job change. It was a chance to be part of something rebuilt on scars. Life at home shifted too. For the first time in years, I drove my son to school. He climbed into the passenger seat, his backpack bouncing against the dashboard. "You're not late," he said with disbelief. "Not even once." I smiled as we passed the morning traffic, the city waking around us. That simple act, being present, felt more rewarding than any promotion I'd ever received. But peace never lasts unchallenged. One afternoon, while reviewing documents at my new desk, an email arrived. The sender was familiar, the network. The subject line was short and unsettling. "The next game begins soon." I sat back, the hum of the office fading. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, or perhaps a warning. That night, as I tucked my son into bed, I thought of the email. I stared at his face as he drifted to sleep, his innocence untouched by the ugliness I had witnessed. Could I protect that by staying quiet? Or would silence simply allow more Richards to thrive? The cliffhanger gnawed at me, to live peacefully or step back into the storm. In the weeks that followed, the company I left behind collapsed. Reports of fraud piled higher than the skyscraper it occupied. Executives scrambled to distance themselves, but it was too late. Clients pulled contracts. Shareholders abandoned ship. The empire Richard had helped build crumbled under the weight of its own rot. The trial that followed drew national attention. Richard, once untouchable, sat in a courtroom stripped of power, his arrogance replaced by hollow eyes. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. I thought I would feel triumphant, but instead, all I felt was weary. Justice had come, but at a cost measured in lives upended, trust broken, and years wasted. Months later, I saw Richard again. Not in a boardroom or headline, but in a community park. He wore plain clothes, handing out meals as part of a volunteer program. Some laughed at the sight, muttering about irony. I didn't laugh. I simply watched. Maybe it was punishment, maybe redemption, maybe both. For the first time, he looked small, ordinary, even human. At home, life stitched itself back together slowly. On my son's birthday, I stood by his side from the first candle to the last. No phone buzzing, no late-night work dragging me away. His laughter filled the house, echoing through walls that had once known only silence and arguments. My wife caught my eye and smiled, not the weary smile she had worn for years, but one of relief. That moment felt like victory. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it comes quietly, like the steady hand of time pushing truth to the surface. It may be late, but it never fails to arrive. That night, after the house had gone still, I checked on my son. He was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in rhythm, with dreams I hoped were gentle. I brushed his hair back and whispered, "I kept my promise." My voice cracked, but I added the words that now define my future. "And I'll keep fighting." Because the fight wasn't over. Richard was only one face in a crowd of predators. The system he hinted at still thrived, waiting in boardrooms and contracts, hiding in plain sight. I didn't know what battles lay ahead, or whether I'd have the strength to win them all. But I knew this: silence was no longer an option. And somewhere out there, the network was waiting.